I don't think people are trying to find themselves anymore. I think they're trying to escape themselves. Everybody wants to become a new version of themselves. A new city, a new aesthetics, new personality, a new life. Delete the old photos, change the wardrobe, rebrand your Spotify playlist. Start saying, this version of me is different. And I don't think it's just self-improvement anymore. I think modern culture turned identity into something temporary, something editable, something you're expected to constantly optimize, because the internet has made it almost impossible to exist continuously. Every few months, there's a new woman to become. And with each new version comes a new label. And labels is something we're completely obsessed with. The clean girl, the cool girl, the hyper-feminine girl, the minimalist girl, the smart girl, the healed girl, the mysterious, emotionally unavailable girl living in Eastern Europe with silver jewelry, sipping her matcha, and that's just one of many. And every aesthetic promises the same thing: transformation. Not acceptance, not understanding, but escape. And cinema romanticizes this too. There's a reason so many coming-of-age films revolve around reinvention. Even Marie Antoinette feels less like a historical film and more like a girl trying to disappear into aesthetics before reality reaches her. And I think a lot of people secretly fantasize about disappearing. Not dying, just leaving, quietly, starting over somewhere nobody knows them. Because reinvention feels seductive. It gives the illusion that suffering belongs to the older version of yourself. That if you change external things, you can outrun the internal ones too. New haircut, new apartment, new city, new habits, new personality. As if identity is something you can redesign, like your bedroom. And social media intensified this obsession completely. People don't just document their lives anymore. They archive, curate, and replace themselves constantly. Entire personalities disappear every 6 months. Someone goes from over the top to minimalist, from a party girl to wellness influencer, drinking her magnesium, electrolytes, and whatever every evening, and so on. And some go from emotionally chaotic and irresponsible to spiritually enlightened. And all of that often happens publicly. It's posted and labeled, as if identity itself became a performance art. And I think what makes this psychologically exhausting is that people are no longer allowed to evolve naturally. They feel pressure to just emerge fully transformed without letting themselves transform gradually over time and without pressure of other people watching. So they feel pressure to emerge fully transformed and to become cinematic, because there's this expectation that growth should be visible and aesthetic and consumable. Not gradual, not messy, not boring. We just cannot even say, I'm slowly changing as a person. We say, this is my new era. And we provide proof with hashtags and vision boards, which sounds harmless until you realize how disconnected people are becoming from permanence, from continuity, from accepting that identity and growth is not always cinematic or dramatic. Sometimes growth is repetitive, quiet, and invisible. But the internet rewards the spectacle, obviously. Definitely not the stability. And maybe that's why so many people feel so detached from themselves now. Because they're constantly obsessed from observing their lives from the outside instead of inhabiting them from the inside. They become just hyper aware of how they are perceived. How their room looks, how their sadness looks, how their healing looks, and how their body and face look while healing. Everything becomes content before it becomes experience. And I think modern loneliness plays a huge role with this obsession with reinvention. Because if nobody feels deeply known anymore, their identity starts feeling negotiable and replaceable. You stop asking, who am I really? Instead, you start asking, which version of me will finally make people admire me? And that's why reinvention culture never really satisfies people, because it treats identity as an aesthetic problem instead of an emotional one. And eventually people realize they've spent years trying to fix all things external while carrying all the same fears internally. The same loneliness, the same insecurity, the same need to be chosen, to be seen, to become someone worth remembering. And it's very hard to be remembered in the current state of social media. I mean, you probably don't even remember what pictures you've seen on your phone today. Sometimes you don't even remember which people you've been following for years. And maybe that's why some people fantasize so much about becoming someone else. Because being yourself feels strangely insufficient in a culture where identity is constantly marketed as something improvable, forever improvable. But I think there's also something sad about constantly needing to replace yourself. Because eventually it stops being about building a new identity and instead it becomes a fight of abandoning all your previous ones, again and again and again. Maybe the most difficult thing now is not transformation. Maybe it's staying long enough inside one version of yourself to finally figure out who that person is. So now I would like to talk about sharing my experience as an international student at NYU and making this topic more relatable to my age. I mean, obviously even all that you've seen now is very much informed by me as a person, but now I like to always transition later more into a very non-scripted part. The first one has some structure. This part is not going to have any structure. But apart from being an NYU student, there's a lot of stuff that happened after I dropped out of NYU for the first time that also affected this, or my POV about this topic. So when I was traveling after I dropped NYU, I was traveling to Australia, to Bali, to Thailand, and traveling means meeting a lot of people, a lot of diverse points of views, a lot of diverse life stories, and so on. I've very much felt like everywhere there was the obsession of people just reinventing themselves. Especially in Bali, I feel like it's a country where people come to reinvent themselves. But strangely enough, although New York is a hugely different place than Bali, like maybe even like the utmost opposite, is also a place where people come to reinvent themselves because it's seen as a country of opportunities, and that means like changing your identity very often. People change their identities in New York and their life paths very, very often. Amount of possibilities here is sometimes overwhelming. Now, obviously it's limited for some people, limited for internationals, not as great as it used to be. The American dream is not, as accessible as it used to be, but still people are definitely changing a lot of things about themselves in New York. And if you compare it to a student point of view, students also like to change their identities a lot, and I would say if not the most, because first of all, they're at an age usually in their 20s where people are naturally playing around with their identities. In New York it can be wild because it's not just identities, it's also, this is no hate, it's just how I perceive it. People often change their pronouns, like sometimes they decide they're this, then they label themselves as this, and that's just one example of what I've personally seen. This is not about me expressing my personal opinion on that, it's just saying what I've seen. People change even these fundamental things quite often in their 20s. And it's not just about this, it can be as simple as changing your major. So many people are changing their majors. It's that major, like once they want to be a math student, so they just brand themselves as science students, medical student grind, then they realize, okay, I actually don't want to do this, and suddenly they switch into art or they switch into history. They become someone completely else just based on changing their major. They change their Instagram bio, they change the way themselves out on social media, they change their posts. There's a completely different change, and they like to constantly post about it and give it out. And something I've noticed that people are often very loud or feel pressured to be very loud about these things, about changing their identity. Instant change of Instagram bio, which was my case. I will admit to that. Once I got into the drama, I just changed my Instagram bio, and I am a victim of some of these things too. So from a student point of view, you can see it on so many things. Even if you don't change your major, the moment you change some of your habits, you market it everywhere. It's like you start posting, instead of, sleeping until lunchtime, suddenly you go for a morning run, morning gym, or you decide to have 8 a.m. classes, and I see people posting about that. People just like to filter everything out and feel the need to constantly rebrand everything and post and post and post. And that need stems from different things. talked about them in the first part of this video. And even if I go back to the Bali example, it's often a country of people who quit their job, all the digital nomads. It's natural that the people are often in the transition of changing their identities or in the process of rebranding themselves, and often they even really have to develop a personal brand in order to be hired by someone, because a lot of these people are doing social media, so they naturally are forced to develop these labeling habits and to be very strategic, mindful about how they present themselves, what they filter out, how they market and label themselves, because everything is gonna affect how much money they're gonna earn, where they're gonna be hired, whether they're gonna be able to continue this life abroad as a digital nomad. And with the era of transitioning into the digital, everyone is kind of forced to be labeling themselves, because when you're just in the online world, you're constantly categorizing people even unknowingly. And if someone is labeled as something, or if someone has strong visual or other cues that they are something, it's much easier for you to process that, and it's much easier for employers to process that. So naturally, by turning our lives and the products or services we offer into digital, we've been just forced to develop this labeling system, both in terms of labeling ourselves and in terms of categorizing and recognizing others as falling under some label. So I feel like it's not just about the current want to abandon an identity, it's also about being forced to develop an identity and to switch between some of your identities based on where you're currently performing, whether you're in your personal life or whether you're in your professional life. And sometimes you can have now so many identities that you're someone else when you're doing sports, you're someone else when you're working, you're someone else with your children, you're someone else with your friends, you're someone else at school. For everything, we have just so many labels that sometimes, even if someone is very sure of themselves and know who they are, they feel like because every single part of themselves as one whole can be labeled, they are suddenly split into so many fragments that it can become even confusing of who you are, even if you know that initially very strongly, because all the micro tiny things about yourselves can be labeled by so many labels that you as a whole feel like too much of a differentiated and complex thing to be labeled. But it's good, because we as humans are complex, but by attaching so many labels, sometimes we are reducing ourselves to one thing, and these labels will never be able to fully contain who we are as a whole person. Now, yes, people are becoming more and more shallow, maybe, and less interesting in the current era, so maybe you know a lot of people who could be literally labeled as one thing and that's it, but we as people are way too complex to be just labeled as something. You could have seemingly contradictory labels attached to yourself, and suddenly you don't know who you're supposed to be, and you feel like you have to choose. Well, you don't have to choose. Probably not gonna be sustainable for you to have many opposing labels, but not all of the labels are really opposing themselves. You can be more things, and you should be more things if you're human. So I think I will end this video here, because I've talked long enough, and I would like you to just remember that you can just fuck labels, it's not that serious. Don't feel obligated to reduce yourself to one or two or three very specific, very narrow labels when you are a complex human creature. So that will be all for me today. So I hope you liked this video, and I hope you like this rant. So I really hope you have a wonderful day, and hopefully see you in my next one. Bye bye.